Welcome to the Covert Access Team podcast. I'm here today with Ritu Gill, who is a master of OSINT, and we're going to be spending this podcast talking about OSINT techniques, why it's valuable, when it works, and pretty much all things open source intelligence. Could you introduce yourself a little bit? Kind of tell us maybe a little bit about yourself, how you got where you are, and why you chose OSINT of all things.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you. Thanks for having me on the podcast. And yeah, a little bit about myself. Have over 17 years in law enforcement and government. I opened up my own consulting business in 2016 because I realized I do have a passion for this OSINT thing, and so it kind of took off, and I've been kind of deep in that since that time. I spent a lot of time doing things like, I teach a lot. I do a lot of OSINT research or, investigations as well. I'm quite involved with the OSINT community online, as a lot of people might follow me if they're interested in OSINT. But yeah, I would say, like, in terms of starting OSINT, so some people do ask, how did I end up here? It wasn't exactly my plan. This is actually way back when I worked for the RCMP. I wanted to be a police officer a long time ago. And while I was doing my bachelor's degree, I met a crime analyst, and I started thinking, like, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. What do you do? And it was kind of by chance I ended up in OSINT because it was through a series of different steps. But when I started looking at kind of the analyst role in this type of work, that's where I started looking in that avenue, which led me to, like, the OSINT world essentially, which took me down a completely different road, which was actually awesome.
Well, most people that I know, I'm 40. Most people, as they age, they tend to their path in life tends to wind. They don't, say, "Hey, when I was 10 years old, I wanted to do this. When I was 20 years old, I wanted to do that. When I'm 30, and so on and so forth." I started out in applied mathematics, and now I break into banks and stuff. So I mean, it's if taking that winding path and ending up in OSINT is certainly not a bad path to take, and it's not surprising. I mean, OSINT's a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you really don't know where you're going to end up, right? Like I said, like, my goal initially was totally something different, but I'm like, I love what I do. And OSINT has just become a huge part of my life. But, like, obviously I spend the majority of my time we're working on things and, teaching people how to do things better. But yeah, it really is a passion, and that's why I do choose so much to spend so much of my time doing it.
That's very yeah. That's to do something that you actually are really passionate about is such a luxury in life. When you actually when your daily job is to do something that you enjoy doing, that's something I mean, that should be the goal. But that begs the question: in the daily life of a professional OSINT person, what do you do? So, what is your daily life like when you get a job on the desk, or when you're running teaching engagements or anything? Like, what is the typical day like for somebody who's doing OSINT full time?
Yeah, so the way I look at that is, I wear a lot of OSINT hats, I like to say. So my day to day it could look different, and it's quite busy. But every day is kind of different depending on whether I'm doing OSINT research or if I'm teaching, if I'm doing a workshop. As an example, I spent a lot of time during conference season presenting at various events internationally. That was quite fun because it included some travel and meeting a lot of new people. But yeah, so I think it really depends on, like, what I'm doing, because I do teach a lot, which has been really fun. I'm One other thing that I got involved in this year is, actually, I'm the president of OSMOSIS Association. I don't know if you've heard of it, but essentially it's a organization where we kind of strive to standardize the OSINT profession, and we provide our members with, like, support and all that kind of stuff in that space to share knowledge and meet other OSINT professionals. And so that's also, they run an OSINT conference usually every year. And I went to, it's the biggest OSINT conference that I've ever attended, but the last one was their 10-year anniversary, and that was in Vegas. So that was really, really neat place to meet a lot of people.
Yeah, when security conferences are in Vegas, you kind of made it, right? Like you get the DEF CON thing, you've got like when your security conference is being held in Vegas, that's when you know it's big. So that right off the bat, congratulations on being, I don't know if you'd say promoted, but elected or put in such a high position. That's really impressive. I mean that really says a lot about your credibility. But that said, for anybody who's interested, where could they go to find more information about this organization?
Thank you. So honestly, if they're Googling Osmosis Association, they will land on the page. It's osmosisinstitute.org is actual website, but even Googling Osmosis Association or Institute, they will get to the website and learn all about it. Yeah, there's lots of good stuff there, lots of good people. But yeah, another great space in the OSINT world.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, community involvement is really important, and so having a big community like that is very very helpful. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that. And again, congratulations. That's I mean, being put or elected into such a high ranking position, it really does say a lot to your credibility. I mean, that's because it's obviously a global entity. I'm looking at it right now. It's a global organization, and yeah, it seems really impressive. But
Thanks so much. I appreciate that.
oh, you're very welcome. I mean, you're the one who rose to the highest ranks, so it's just giving you your kudos. And but that begs the question. So, what are your favorite OSINT tools? What is you when you run an OSINT investigation? What are your go-to methods or sources or techniques?
Yeah, so that's a big question. It really depends on what kind of investigation it is because, you know, you're working on different ones, right? So like when it comes to tools, the one thing, we try to teach people, especially new people in OSINT, is it's not all about the tools. A lot of it is it's a mindset, it's critical thinking, because we don't want people to forget these things that really matter especially when you're reporting up things. If you want to be able to articulate things in a certain way as well when you're doing this stuff. So favorite tools, honestly, it's so hard to just say one or a few, but like I I love some of the ones like, I mean, there's certain ones that are like email search engines or phone number search engines. Things like Epios is one of them. It's a tool, really, really good. Yeah, really good quality results and super helpful for like connecting the dots between, email address and the results the accounts it's associated to. I can at the same time, there's that one side of it. There's other tools out there, whether they're, visual tools to visualize like social network analysis kind of thing. There's things like there's something I co-founded called Forensic OSINT, which is a documentation Chrome extension. And that's again, we always talk about saving what you see when you see it, because things get removed from the internet so quickly or somebody deletes it. So that's what Forensic OSINT's about. It's about preserving online evidence.
That's a very good point. If I remember correctly, even the Wayback Machine recently started hemorrhaging pages left and right. So yeah, being able to grab screenshots and grab things as they come is probably very, very helpful. So thank you, by the way, for inventing a new tool for the community to use, because that's always a huge plus. So what is I'm just out of curiosity, what is your take on tools like dehashed or PIMIs or things like that? Do you think they're overblown? Are they actually helpful? Because these are kind of the two, I would say, best known tools that also cost money.
Yeah. You mentioned PIMIs, right? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, yeah. So when I think of something like PIMIs, I've used it. I've paid for it before as well. Because you kind of want to test the tools, right? You want to
Right.
see, is this of value? Is this going to give me the results I'm looking for? And it really depends on obviously who you're investigating. The times I've used PIMIs and I paid for it, it actually gave me good results that I wasn't getting just doing the manual searches. So it obviously does have a level of, facial recognition or something in there, that it's not just a Google reverse image search type of thing. So it's always good to see where you're like, hey, this actually can or has the possibility to produce things that I wouldn't be able to do. But yeah, and then you had mentioned dehashed. I think there's a few different perspectives of like breach data and that kind of stuff, but um, it can be really helpful for some OSINTers that are able to use that type of data. But I know depending on who you work for and that will really matter in terms of whether you're government or you're private, if you can use that type of data, right? But yeah, definitely. I mean, lots of people out there use it. It's just different
Right.
schools, um, different perspectives.
That's interesting. I hadn't considered the fact that you're probably right. The public sector probably doesn't. Well, maybe. I don't know. Do you think that the public or the private sector would use more breach data, assuming you can say?
So I would say private
Hmm.
sector would use it, whereas like personally, I don't think government would really want to use it because again, it depends on what government you work for. If you work for a government, right? Because again, it's stolen information, so it may not look so good that way. But so on the private side, I think you can definitely have access to some of that stuff a lot. It's just gonna they have different kind of ways of working. So
Sure. Well, yeah, that makes sense. Do you find so now that you're in the in the private sector, do you find the I guess how to go about engagements? Is it easier? Is it harder? Because in my experience, when you're working for the public sector, money is kind of no object, right? So if you want to say, well, take 3, 4, 5 months to run an engagement or something, yeah, that's fine. But if you're in the private sector and you say, hey, spend 5 months full time for an entire team, like most companies can't afford it. So
right.
there's a big difference between, public sector work, private sector work, and is there one that you think is easier or better?
Yeah. I think, I mean, I don't know if one's better or not. I think they're just really different spaces to be in. But that said, like, a lot of people will say to me, sorry, your question reminds me of a question that I get sometimes saying
Sure.
like, hey, when do you know you're done your OSINT investigation? Like, because they're like, I'm like, well, there's a few factors, but sometimes it's when you run out of money. And it's like, or right, like it's like, okay, well, we can only spend this much or these many hours on this file. But also knowing that from the get-go will help you kind of set up your research ahead of time. So you know very pointedly where you're going to go and what you're going to use, rather than be like blanket, okay, I don't know how many hours I have. It's better to know I'm going to focus differently if you tell me I have 2 hours versus 4 hours.
Wow. Oh, have you ever actually done an OSINT investigation in 2 hours? That seems really
Uh,
short.
Yeah, I would call it more like OSINT research and being able to, it's kind of like that quick something happens and you need to react and you're like, oh, it's an active situation. Say you see something in the news as an example, something comes out and it's like, yeah, like there's people out there that will be like, oh, here's the situation, and they're trying to like go archive somebody's social media and that kind of stuff before it's gone. It's like time is of the essence, right? You gotta kind of act on it if you're going to be doing that ASAP. But yeah, that's obviously not a full out investigation. It's literally, quick OSINT. I think it's really hard to do a good job in such a short time, because
Sure.
I know some organizations as well, like sometimes you have whether it's management or leadership that don't really understand that you can't do it in a few hours. This is something that could last weeks. It could last, you could be working up something on one individual and it could take you a while.
Yeah, that that's very yeah. Um, that's not surprising that yeah. I once had uh somebody scope a project for me, a physical breach for 2 days. And when I asked them why did you scope it for such a short period of time, they told me, "Oh, well, I've never done this before. I'm in sales and I've never scoped a physical engagement before, so I assumed you'd break into the building on Monday and then write the report on Tuesday." And I was like, "Oh God." Um,
Oh.
yeah. So but that said, what do you consider to be kind of if you had your way and you're talking to a client and he says, hey, I want you to run an investigation, what is your standard, like how many days or hours do you typically want to put into an engagement?
So for me, it really depends on what someone's online footprint looks like, right? Because, you Google, like, say you Google my name, there's a lot of stuff out there on me, but it's on purpose. But I have a large online footprint, depending on who your target is. Like, might have a really unique name, and you're like, I'm not really getting much on that name at all. Like, I mean, obviously, if there's not a lot to go through, it's not going to take you as long typically, right? You're still going to check all the places that you would typically check, but you're not going to come back with so much data that you're like overwhelmed. Whereas, like, not only for me, I do have a large online footprint, but my name is also very common. Like, it's, and some people don't think that, but I'm like, no, there's like, I mean, put Ritu Gill in any social media platform and you'll get so many, right? It's very common. So, obviously because of what I do, it's very specific to OSINT, and that's what my platform's around. But yeah, for me, I'm like, if you do have a request where the name is so common, I always tell people, I'm like, what is unique to that person? So, do you know where they work, right? Do you know what kind of hobbies they do that they might associate with online? Um, Anything like that, even location. Do you know, okay, it's Ritu and she lives in Seattle, or she lives in Vancouver, or she lives, pick whatever and see if you can narrow down the search a bit more. So when you have too much information.
That's honestly, that's something that I hadn't even thought about until you brought it up, is just information overload. Because you're probably right. If you have a public figure or somebody with a common name and you just start Googling or going into any method, yeah, you're probably going to have mountains and mountains of leads. How do you winnow it down fast? So I mean, you probably have, let's say for the sake of argument, let's say you're given a week to run an investigation, um, and you get a common name, right? Like my name's super common, Brian Harris.
Yeah.
You get, God, you probably have millions of hits. Like, how do you winnow it down in a really fast way?
Yeah. So for me, like, a couple of things right away, I would be like, okay, where does this person reside? Are they in the US? Are they in Canada? Are they somewhere else? Because public records, right? So for me, I think of like, if I can narrow that focus, that's a starting point. If you are US based, I might straight go to one of the source, yeah, a couple of the sources, trying to give me some of the basics of if I can pin down your location and then get more information about, like, kind of like pivot points, like different things that I could use to search further. Um, but even with, so like, that's one way to look at it. The other way is like, yeah, you have a common name. You want to, before you even dig in, you want to find out everything. What's your starting point? Is it just the name, or do you have more? Do you have a phone number? Do you have an email address? What do you know about this person, right? Um, and then for me, like, yeah, there's going to be like the main things that you're going to go to: search engines, but not just Google. You're going to want to use a couple, right? They index different parts of the web. So for me, I'm like, using Google Docs. Can you refine that search in any way? I mean, it's crazy how many people put their resume online and it's
Sure.
like publicly available. I'm not saying our targets will necessarily do that, but you never know depending on who the target is. Social media is another one, right? If you can't find them on kind of the heavy hitters, Facebook, Instagram, and all that, what are niche platforms that they might be on because of their age, maybe, right? I always think of that too. Or maybe they have a really like particular hobby where they're on, like, they might be part of some channel or something that you're like, okay, you might get some insights on.
Interesting. Interesting. Is there any location, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, that is a gold mine of information that people don't think about? Like for me, I would, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, like things like this. But is there any place that you typically like you go to and people just kind of for whatever reason don't think about it?
Um, just trying to think here. I mean, really, like, every platform has its weak points. So for me, if I get some indication that you might be on a certain platform, I start trying to dig in to see if I can Google dork my way
Mm,
into finding information.
sure.
But yeah, like, yeah, that's one way to look at it. I mean, what else? Other things, like, I mean, I always find that email addresses are a gold mine, because they're directly connecting to certain platforms.
Right.
But even things like, I mean, I've seen different websites show up or different accounts show up, like whether it's on, Red Note became really famous recently, also known as the Little Red Book because of the whole TikTok stuff. But again, like, I've seen people on that where I'm like, oh, this is interesting. How can I dig into it? Kind of looks like Instagram from the last time I looked at it.
Right.
With a kind of a spin of TikTok, maybe a bit. I don't know. I haven't looked at it in a bit, but yeah, so it really depends. It's amazing how many people like leave old information up. So like people so it could be they when they were in college they had a Facebook and they just left it and they deleted it, or didn't delete it, they left it and they stopped posting, but it's still there. That's like information that could be collected by somebody if you become a target, right, for some reason.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Um, do you find that people are often surprised by how much information is the average person has out there? Is it something that they just don't care, or they don't think about, or are they actually like surprised, like, wow, I actually didn't know how much, data I've put out there?
I think people are pretty unaware, depending on, again, if they're not from this industry where they don't see this day in, day out. I think they're unaware, and I think when you bring it to their attention, I think they are surprised. They're like, "Holy smokes, I didn't realize." But until that point, it's like things don't get better always, right? It usually takes a bad incident for people to be like, "Okay, I need to do better. I need to,"
Yeah.
uh, that's what I feel, at least, from the things I've seen over the years.
So when you're running an investigation, well, let me before I ask that question, what is there any piece of information, any typical piece of information that you would recommend do not ever, I mean, obviously like social security numbers or whatever else, but what is the most dangerous piece of information you can put as a normal person online outside of something like, your credit card, number or social security number or something?
Yeah, like, okay, so there's the obvious ones, but even like I said, one of my favorite starting points is email addresses. So I think people need to protect those things, but they're not always well protected. You can find them
Mm,
everywhere, right?
sure.
Um, you see in Facebook chatter sometimes where people are like, "Oh yeah, email me here," or on LinkedIn, "Email me here." I don't recommend that typically. Again, if it's related to your personal identity and all that kind of stuff, and your personal accounts. Again, because it could be a gold mine of information for somebody looking to do harm me, or spam you with stuff, or you never know how you could be targeted, really. And some
Sure.
of the scams out there are quite sophisticated nowadays.
That is true. I'm sure most people are now familiar with the poor guy who got, I don't know what to even call it, but he got tricked. Hong Kong gentleman who got tricked by thinking the CTO of the company called him and requested, to move $25 million because it was the guy's
Oh,
exact voice and exact face and everything. And he got tricked into it. And, God bless him. I'm
yeah.
sure he got fired.
Yeah, spoofing is yeah, the whole voice cloning thing is quite scary. But yeah, that's why I was like, I mean, I've people have asked like, "Oh, what do you do in that instance?" And I'm like, "Well, maybe you should have a safe word with your family and the people that are closest to you." Also, because when a lot of older people get targeted for some of these scams that I've seen recently, it's quite sad to see.
Yeah,
But you want to be able to educate them in terms of like, okay, this is how not to get scammed. And, you can't, just because somebody's saying something online does not make it true. And for people like us, it might be very simple, but it isn't as simple for people that didn't grow up with, this kind of technology, computers. They don't understand what's happening. So it's like trying to give them techniques that will help them, right? Safe words and, you know, certain questions that you can ask somebody, right? Like that only a certain person would know. So, almost fact checking what's happening. But I just tell people, I'm like, just don't answer the phone. Okay. And don't stop talking to random people that call. Cause yeah, the spoofing thing is a big one, right? We've seen a lot of that.
no, that's that. Yes, we have, and it is a huge Huge threat. And you're absolutely right. The people who typically get targeted are like the most vulnerable, the older, the elderly, the people who don't really think about it or haven't grown up with it, like you said.
Right.
Um, yeah, having a safe word is a really really clever trick. I mean, having some way of validating, people who are in that kind of vulnerable category. Yeah, it's that's really really good advice, honestly. So I'm glad you brought that up. Are there any other tricks, by the way, that you would recommend to, like, maybe older people, or something you could teach to older people, like, hey, do this or do that, or aside from don't answer the phone.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, it's really just like, I mean, sometimes it's really getting down to the basics of like, even just explaining what some of these concepts are, even what spoofing is, right? They don't know what that even means. And then you tell them and they're like, what? Like they don't understand that's where we're at right now. Right.
Yep.
But that's why, typically you don't have the bank calling and being like, hey, transfer me this much money, or you need to go, we're trying to prevent a scam, so you need to go buy gift cards, and trying to explain how that's not something that is real. It can be a challenge, right? Because people get quite convinced by these scammers as well. But that's why I go back to some of those basics, and I already mentioned the keyword, the safe word, just to something, especially if it's like supposed to be family. Well, you can always, if you're really like, oh my God, I believe it's actually my nephew calling or whoever. Well, is it? But yeah, definitely we're unfortunately at that stage where, yeah, seeing isn't always believing, or hearing is not always believing, if you want to think of it like that, with all the voice spoofing and all that kind of stuff, right? But this
That's
goes back to like why you want to keep your information private, because people obviously are learning stuff about you or about your personal life from doing some kind of, research, and that's what you want to protect as well, so you don't end up in even situations like that if you can, avoid it somehow.
that's very true. Yeah, it's funny when I kind of help people do social engineering and elicitation. I tell them to go talk to strangers. I tell them to get comfortable talking to people. And when you're trying to elicit information and you're trying to pull information out of people, the easiest targets are going to be people who think they're about to get a lot of money out of you. So if you ever get that, when you got like an elicitation student and you get like that Indian call center call, it's like a gold mine,
Yeah.
because you're like, oh, now great, now I get to practice for the next like 2 hours while I try to get to every piece of information out of this guy. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's really good, because like having the voice call thing especially is really like, being able to protect older people is, yeah, it's really really helpful, and obviously the government can't do it because there's just too many. Um,
Yeah.
so here's a question for you, kind of going to technique on OSINT that I have. When I tend to use dehashed whenever I'm running OSINT, just because I just find it convenient. I used to like using things like raid forms and breach forms and what have you. I'm interested to get your opinion on that, but the FBI made that obsolete. But when you go to a place like dehashed, let's say you start off with an email, and then the
Mhm.
email references a username, and then the username references something else. How do you validate that these pieces of data, the username, the email, the phone number, how do you validate that they're actually associated with the person you think they are? Is there a way or a method or technique that you could use to say, okay, I think that this username is this person, but actually confirming it?
Yeah. So for me, like if I'm going through my OSINT research, I am making note of all these things that I'm finding, right? I'm making note of everything I'm finding about them online, whether it's an account, maybe it has a profile photo, maybe it doesn't. Anything that you can find, and track it the way you're tracking it. For me, there's username enumeration services out there, right? There's tools out there like what's my name.app, which you can plug in a username, and then it tells you it's on all these platforms, right? So that's essentially, how do we fact check that, right? So that's always the question. How do we determine that, you know, um, whether it's Bob Smith, it's the same Bob Smith, right? We don't know, but the verification part of that is our job to, is there anything else on that account that is very similar to other things you've seen related to this person online? is there a photo of the individual, or do they have like, we often you'll see people with the same profile photo but on 5 different services. I don't take anything at face value. So this is why we say fact check and make sure that you do know. You might be like, okay, well, there might be something to indicate it's the same person, whether it's the same profile photo being used, but you need to take it further. Do they have followers and friends that are consistent across platforms? Right? That might also give you another indication. Where are those people located? Can you see that they're from a certain area? And it's like, oh, all these friends are all from Seattle, right? So I'm like, oh, it makes sense. That's where the target's from. That kind of stuff. So it's not just one way. There's multiple ways to kind of fact check that. Um, yeah, and that's kind of yeah, that's part of our job, which can be a lot when you have a very common name or
Yeah.
username.
Yeah, for sure. I kind of wanted to talk about you're talking about we're talking about validation right now, and I know that I think it was last week even Meta or Facebook or whatever we're calling it these days, they announced that they're going to start allowing kind of AI people, like AI profiles, almost like sock puppets on their platform, and it'll have photos and it'll tweet it or not tweet out. What do you call a Facebook post? I guess it's just a Facebook post.
Yeah.
It'll make all those things, and then somewhere in the profile it'll say this is basically a fake person. How do you feel about that? And does it make your job harder to filter out like real people from AI?
Yeah, I mean, there's always giveaways. Like, I mean, that was an interesting thing I saw from Facebook too, because I was like, what, aren't they creating a problem that they were trying to solve at some point? Because they were like, no fake accounts, no recent, no sock puppets. Uh, yeah, I feel, that obviously if you're now trying to decipher real, which we already are in that situation where there are lots of fake accounts in multiple platforms, right? Bot accounts and all sorts of things. Definitely, I would say, I mean, when it comes to AI, I mean, there's an AI tool for everything. AI can help us, but it can also hurt us. And for me, I'm like, as things evolve, whether we start seeing, these fake accounts by the actual platform, yeah, it's going to be just another thing that we need to fact check. But yeah, it can definitely create some noise though, right?
Yeah, for sure. That I mean, that begs the question. Like, do you think that AI is more helpful or more kind of a hindrance when it comes to OSINT stuff? Do you tend to lean as an expert? Do you tend to use AI more, or just kind of like, ah, it's just too much of a hassle?
I think it's important to know how to use AI, right? Yeah, I actually have an OSINT friend named Ray Baker who's writing a book on OSINT and AI, and I believe it's going to come out later this year.
Hmm.
I don't know if it's like towards the end of the year, but yeah, she's
Hmm.
already written one OSINT book, but I'm
Oh,
very curious on like her kind of take on it and what's included in the book. But I think it'll be really good because I think it is one of those things that AI is not something that people should ignore or be scared of, but how can we use it to do our work better? Can it help us? It doesn't always help us, right? Sometimes you need to know what task it can help you with, and then some things that you're like, no, this is not going to help for this type of thing. But that also is going to continue to evolve, I think, in this time.
of course. Yeah. Do you happen to have any currently favorite AI tools that you like to use?
I have it again, it kind of depends. Like for me, I do like to like use it to summarize articles. There's times where it's like a really long article and I don't have time to summarize it. Obviously played around with Chat GPT lots. I've come across Google Notebook, which was quite interesting. But again, to see how some of these evolve, it'll be good. But yeah, Chat GPT is probably the one that I use the most though. But yeah, it definitely can help you speed up things that you can't as human people do faster without, right?
Oh yeah.
Certain things that certain tasks it can help with, but it has its limits though, right? It doesn't
Hmm.
have the human brain at the end of the day, not yet. So again, that's where I think there's some limitations.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. Yeah, it's funny how smart and dumb AI is simultaneously. So yeah, it does some
Yeah.
certain things very well, and it does certain things terribly. And then there's also the problem with breaching. You know, we see that from time to time. Every website will get hacked eventually. It's inevitable. And
Right.
we see AI and people saying, "Oh wow, ChatGPT and Midjourney and all these things are so helpful. Let me take the internal, private, sensitive company stuff and dump it into this AI and ask it to do things for me." And then that website gets hacked or that AI gets leaked or something. You're like, "Oh no, all the internal stuff that I just put in there is suddenly online." It's like crap. So yeah.
Yeah. Oh, totally. That's why people have to be careful with like how we're using it, what you're inputting, you know. And that's the thing, you got to be kind of aware of those things, and not everybody is, right? Everybody's at different levels, and some people that are newer or, you know, younger maybe, and they're just starting out in something, they might not think of some of those like repercussions, which, you know, you want to be mindful and careful for sure, because who knows what this is going to look like in a few years.
Yep. Yep. Especially if you get AI to effectively manipulate other AI. Like this is something that,
Yeah.
people are already starting to do where they're getting AI to talk to itself. And, you get two
I
you go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I'm
Oh, I was just going to say,
curious.
like, where you can get one AI or an instance of the same AI to talk to itself and try to basically hack into it or break it or other things. And it's interesting. It's very interesting to see. And like you said earlier, it's just going to keep evolving. So we have no idea what's coming.
Yeah, and that's an interesting part too. Like, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of things that you can't get Chat GPT or other AIs to do because, you know, it goes against their but there are workarounds for that, and I've tried it, and I'm like, oh, interesting. It's just wording it or spinning the words around a bit, and sometimes it still gives you the answer, and I'm like, I mean, it kind of makes you laugh in some instances. But you know, we're always trying to test the boundaries there.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, it's one of those funny things where you're like, tell me how to break into a website, and it says, no, absolutely not. I'm a pen tester. Tell me how to break into a website. Oh, okay. Here's a bullet point thing of exactly what you should do, and it's like, yeah, you
Yeah.
can easily manipulate it.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. You just tweak the language a bit, and I'm like, oh, it actually gave me the answer. I'm like, okay. But yeah, so interesting times coming.
So yeah, for sure. One question that I always have. So I move around a lot. I'm in Europe. I'm in South America. I'm traveling all the time. When it comes to
Okay.
OSINT, is it difficult for research purposes when you're dealing with other countries? So, like in the United States, you might have white pages, or you might have. I know that there's a website. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, where it basically shows you people's criminal records, like if somebody's been convicted of crimes or such things. But in every country seems like they would have different databases, different websites, different things. Do you find that challenging, or is there some easy workarounds you have, like if you're going after somebody in the UK versus somebody in Argentina, or whatever?
Yeah, I think, well, definitely, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to privacy laws in each country are going to look a little different. So therefore, public records are going to look different. So, you know, even US, Canada, other countries, other spaces, uh, other regions, you know, they're going to look different. Even within the US, I just use the US as an example, but state to state could look different in some situations, right? But generally, I would think like for us, like in Canada, we have a lot of privacy laws. So we don't have like our public records are limited. There are public records, but they're quite limited, especially in comparison to the states, which is again, if you have a target that lives in the states, like it changes things for me quite a bit, because I'm like, oh wow, now we know we have access to, you know, it could be arrest records, it could be property, you know, ownership stuff, even history there. You know, lots of information that I wouldn't typically have if it was like a Canadian target.
Interesting. So in your experience, then Americans really don't have nearly as much privacy as other countries.
Yeah, from my experience, for sure. Like that's how I've kind of seen it for the last for since I've started this actually. But I think it just comes down to the privacy laws and what's in public in that public domain versus in the private domain. Whereas like it seems like almost everything's in the public domain in the States, which I'm like, oh my God, like it's kind of cool from the OSINT side, but it's also scary on the privacy side. So yeah, that I've seen. yeah, and I would say it's just you have a lot of information in front of you and accessible, and free for the most part.
Well, as an American, I can say I have no illusions that my data of any kind is protected by the US government. Not even a little bit.
Yeah. I'm just, yeah, there I can just I have examples of I've done searches on individuals, and I'm like, okay, wow, if they're, in a certain state, and I'm like, holy smokes, what you can find. I'm like, that was insane. But yeah, definitely can, again, OSINT side really good for information collection, but from the privacy side, I'm like, ooh, this is concerning.
Yeah. So that raises an interesting question. Um, is there ever any concern when you're doing an investigation that you might be violating some kind of privacy law? So, you said that Canadians have a lot more privacy than Americans. Is there anything when you're running an investigation that you have to be careful about what you look for, or like, we mentioned dehashed and PIM-Is and things earlier. Is there any instance where, running dehashed on people's breach data from Canada, say, would be illegal, or some derivative thereof?
Yeah, I think it depends on who your customer is, right? Essentially who you're working for and what their parameters are around what you can and can't do. Um, but again, like, yeah, I think it really depends on, again, where you're based and where you're doing that research probably matters, as well. So that might have an impact on it. But these are good things to think about, because sometimes it's just because it's out on the internet doesn't mean it's like a free for all always, right? Yeah, it's there, but there's always that, there's going to be concerns from various agencies or organizations where it's like, ah, yeah, but should you have been collecting that information, right? That whole thing about breach data because it's stolen is like that one prime example. But again, that can look very different depending on who you are and who you work for or who your customer is.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I mean, I used to love the fact that you could get the breach data just because it was easy for pen testing. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
but now that, I mean, it's a double edged sword, right? Like, for people like us, having that data is good for pen testing or OSINT or other things, but then of course the bad guys have it too. So, um,
Yep.
when it comes to, in my line of work, I'm very invested in physical security, physical pen testing and that sort of thing. What resources would you recommend for physical pen testers who want to run OSINT style things? So, like, if you wanted to know maybe the building layout, if a
Hmm.
company has like third parties like cleaners or janitors or any kind of thing like that, are there any sources or methods or techniques or tools that you might recommend?
Yeah, I mean, when I think of, like, I mean, you said the first one, like building like a layout. I don't spend a ton of time using mapping software, but like some of the stuff, even simple as Google Maps, like at some point they were giving, and I'm sure it's still available, but you can literally see inside certain businesses. You can get a full layout, lay of the land kind of thing. Which again, from the security side, you're like, ooh, that's not good. But at the same time, it's an open source resource, and there will be people that use it for good. There'll be people that use it for bad as well, right? But yeah, again, when it comes to building layouts, for sure, I think mapping, there's a lot of mapping tools out there that can help you. Um, like sometimes even like real estate stuff, right? Like you'll see things for sale, and then you'll, click on something and you can literally do a walk through the entire home, and you're like, holy, you know exactly who lives here, or you can see everything because they don't, they haven't really done a good job of putting their stuff away the way they should have, maybe just on the
Right.
privacy side. It like indicates like that they, you definitely have whether it's like kids living in the house, or there's obviously there's limits to what you can do, but
Yes.
yeah, so for pen testers, I think on the physical side, yeah, like that would be really really helpful, getting familiar with some of the mapping tools out there.
Fair enough. Um, so one question that I always have when it comes to this type of work is, what do you think is in your line of work is the most common mistake that somebody who's running an OSINT investigation would make? Is it underscoping the project? Is it going down false trails? What do you think is something that you see junior OSINT investigators do that you're like, oh man, that's a big mistake there?
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest things is they will use their own personal accounts to do the research. So so I don't know if it's out of some people it could be being lazy, and sometimes it's just hard to create sock accounts, right? Sock puppets, as we
Sure.
like to call them. But that's one mistake I think the younger or the, yeah, when you're starting out earlier and you just don't really realize the repercussions of that. Because it takes one click, right? And you're logged into, who you actually are. And if it was somebody like me, and say I'm logged into my LinkedIn, and then I'm like start creeping on a target, and I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I left a footprint, right? And maybe they have a paid version of LinkedIn that gives them some insight into who's looking at them. I mean, that's not going to look good because right on my profile it says what I do. Uh, so again, like that's one of those things where, yeah, maybe everyone doesn't have that same online footprint, but if you still don't want your real name attached to your investigation like that, right? In that way, it can make you vulnerable. It can make you put you in a weird position, just depending on, again, like what your online presence looks like and everything. But we recommend in OSINT, like you want to create research accounts. You want to have a barrier between you and your investigation, you and your target as well.
Fair enough. You've brought up sock puppets several times. Do you kind of do it just like manually? Like, okay, I'm going to create a Proton Mail account and I'm going to, do whatever. Or is there some tool or thing that you recommend for someone who wants to spin up a sock puppet?
Yeah, there's I mean, I've definitely written about it, written blogs about it. There's lots of options. Some people like to just go for it. It is quite challenging nowadays to do that. There is a service that actually specializes in it. It's called sockpuppet.io, I believe.
Hmm.
I'm just trying to see if I'm getting the right yeah. So it's called sockpuppet.io. Again, they make it easier for you to create a sock puppet essentially. That out of service, that's one that I would recommend, but there's also people that want to give it a try themselves and see, but a lot of people do understand it can be quite challenging to set up accounts. That's why there's so many blog posts on how to do it. But yeah, it's kind of nice if it can, sometimes if you can pay a service to do it and help you through that process, it'll make your life easier.
Fair enough. And yeah, I mean, so you referenced that you've written about this on your blog. Could you let people know where they could go to read your blog?
Yeah, for sure. For the most part, like where I'm in a lot of different places, but forensicosint.com. We have an articles section, and under there you'll see the different articles I've written um over time just about OSINT. And I know there's a recent one about sock puppets, and there was another one that I wrote about sock puppets earlier. So yeah, definitely a few options. But yeah, I when you're doing the research, you'll definitely come across like people talking about research accounts or sock puppets, depending how they name it. But there's some good information out there.
Fair enough. That's excellent. All right. So I asked you what the biggest mistake that an OSINT investigator might make, but what do you think is the biggest mistake that people make when it comes to leaving, information online? Is it, oh, when I was in high school, I had a Facebook or even a MySpace account, if you're old enough. I actually don't know if MySpace is still a thing. Um, but is it leaving those accounts open? Is it like what's the biggest mistake that you see people make online?
I think, well, there's a couple of different sides. Like one, people that don't use privacy settings, like they just leave everything open and exposed, like almost giving too much information about your personal life out there. I think that's one. The other one is people that use like very simple passwords that like anybody could guess, like because it's like their dog's name and like a number. So like I feel like those are the ones that I'm like, and sometimes those people don't really, like, people learn the hard way, right? They get hacked, and then they're like, oh shoot. And when you ask what was your password, and you're like, you got to be kidding me, right? You're just like, okay, we got to do a little better than that. But yeah, so the two sides of it, right? Like things simple as password, using a better password so you don't get hacked. It's not something that anybody could just guess. And the other side of it is just like, okay, well, I think there's limits. Personally, from my perspective, there should be limits to what you share about, your personal side of your life. Um, Again, some people are like, oh, I don't have anything to hide. I'm like, yeah, but sometimes, things happen, and that answer might change.
That is very true. Yeah, it's yeah. I mean, it's always very interesting when people say, "Well, I have nothing to hide, so I have nothing to fear," and it's like, but you don't know. You don't know. Maybe you do.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um. So you also now you have a blog, but you also have some training that you're running for people who are interested in getting into OSINT. Could you let people know like what that is or where they could go to find it? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people who want to get, into the OSINT game or even increase what they already know.
Yeah, I always tell people, like, once you get searching, there's lots of OSINT articles out there. I've written a bunch, but I'm definitely not the only person. A bunch of articles I've written are on forensicosint.com. That's also where you can find the documentation tool. But again, even if you're Googling things like what is OSINT, how to get into OSINT, you will probably come across at least one of my blog posts about it, which will give people tips on how to get into it, because I do get a lot of those questions. That's one of the reasons I wrote those, because so many people were DMing me just asking me some of the simple ones. So I was like, oh, I might as well just write a blog, and then I can direct people, okay, here's what I wrote here in this last, and it's been updated and that kind of thing. But yeah, and if people are interested in like being part of a professional organization, Osmosis is great for that. Um, they do a OSINT conference. The next one will be in 2026. It's going to be in Florida. And so, yeah, that's going to be a pretty exciting event. But that's, again, if you want to meet up with other OSINT people, it's a really great venue to, network with people. And it's a good space. You get a lot of good people showing up at that event.
Very good. That's excellent. I hope people take you up on that and they join the community and they go to the conference. So a question kind of from the OSINT side of things, but maybe you don't get asked very often, but from a business side of OSINT, who is typically your client? Are we talking private citizens? Are we talking major corporations, governments, law enforcement? Maybe they're looking for missing persons. Like, who are usually like the clients who are actually paying OSINT investigators?
Yeah, for me it kind of depends. I mean, it can go everything from like a insurance company to, I typically, a lot of my work, I teach a lot of law enforcement. So, doing workshops and that kind of thing. So I work pretty closely with law enforcement because that's kind of been all my experience as well. So I feel like I can speak the language. But yeah, which does help, right? So yeah, like typically that is who I'm kind of working with. Yeah, for me, general public isn't something I do much at all, actually. Like it's usually, unless somebody's like, how do I get into OSINT? Usually it's that type of thing, but not for investigations and those type of things.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense. The law enforcement would have a major need for OSINT tools and OSINT training. Um, for the general person, do you need any type of certification? Do you need any kind of like special college degree? Do you feel like you need something in order to like get started with OSINT, or is it something that anybody could do?
I think anybody can do it if you're that interested and curious about it. Like, I mean, it helps to have research skills, which a lot of people, if you're in school, you're going to have some of those skills as well. But you can build up on a lot of these skills as well, right? One thing that I'll give Osmosis another plug, but they also offer a OSC, a certificate, open source certificate, which again, they can write the exam, and at the end you'll get a cert, which is
Mhm.
just provides, again, some organizations want that. They want
Sure.
their employees or staff to have it. So it's something that is worth looking into. But yeah, it kind of depends on where you are in your journey, because everybody starts out somewhere, and as you're building up and you're connecting, it's a process. And honestly, every day I'm learning something new. It's been doing this for a while, but every day I learn something from even people that are new in it and other people that have been in it for a long time. So that journey never really ends.
Fair enough. Now, one question that I am curious about is, so, if you were to talk to somebody in the pen testing world or cyber defense and you asked, how often is a new CVE coming out? And they're like, well, every minute, every minute of every day, there's a new CVE, there's a new exploit, there's a new tool.
Yeah.
Do you feel that the OSINT world moves that fast? Do you think that there's like new tools, new breaches, new techniques, new things? How fast do you think this is? Meaning that if I've been doing OSINT for a little while as an amateur, but I haven't picked it up in like 6 months, are there so many new tools and so many new methods that I'm like totally behind?
I think it quite possibly, yes. In some ways, yes, you could be really behind. When it comes to tools, yes, tools, change, techniques change quite often. So that type of thing, like 6 months is a long time. I would say if you've missed out a chunk of 6 months, you have a lot of catching up to do. But that said, I've been asked before, people are like, oh, well, is OSINT a full-time job? I'm like, oh, 100% it's a full-time job. Whereas some, I think, organizations just wanted somebody to do it on the side. Hey, spend 30 minutes and that's your OSINT and that's part of your job now. But I'm like, well, it's literally a full-time job, but it depends, right? It depends on what you're trying to get out of it, what the purpose is. But yeah, so that's kind of, yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
No, it's perfect. I mean, honestly, I think that that's the right answer. Um, I mean, I say that anybody in the cyber world, from OSINT to pen testing to defense to compliance, anything, they've got such a hard job because things move so fast and they're just moving faster and faster. And I think it's going to get worse and worse with as AI gets more and more prevalent. I expect
Yeah, yeah.
I expect that you guys are going to have so much, you're going to just get information overload with tools and techniques and AI and all this kind of stuff. That's my thought.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, no, totally. I agree. Like, not only do things keep changing, things keep changing. I mean, whether it's somebody, you're like you mentioned breaches. If you're somebody who does that type of, you use that as a data source, oh my God, there's breaches every day. I'm like, okay, well, that's a lot. That's a lot to look at. But yeah, I find week to week, like I write an OSINT newsletter that comes out every Friday. And for me as well, like some weeks it's like, holy smokes, like I always have information. It's more eliminating what to include in the newsletter rather than adding, because I keep it quite concise and to the point. But at the same time, because there's so much information and blog posts and people writing, you know, um, what's changed this week, okay, from another, like these things constantly are changing on us. So it's on us to stay on top of it, especially the people that are kind of in the industry and, want to stay kind of on top of things.
Fair enough. So I was recently doing an OSINT, part of an OSINT investigation, and we were looking for somebody who had extremely good operational security. They had almost no online presence, which is shocking because they were middle aged. Um, what do you do if you hit a dead end or you hit like a brick wall, right? Like say go after somebody and they are a ghost. Is there any Hail Mary pass that you can do, or do you just congratulate them and be like, all right, you did a great job, well done?
Yeah, you can definitely, I mean, they have good OPSEC. That means at the end of the day, if I'm finding I'm hitting a dead end, I will try to see if I can. So typically if you can't find your main target, you go to your secondary targets, who are the people closest to their circle, right? To find information about them, right? That's I find it's like, okay, you can't find your main target, but it's always the girlfriend posting or the mom posting about the, actual target. So they don't necessarily have to be leaking something out. It could be someone that's just close to them. But you know what, in all seriousness, like that doesn't always happen either. There's people that are just extremely tight, the group's tight, and they're really good with OPSEC. And there are times where we're like, we tried, but we're not getting what we are hoping to find. The other side of that is there are people who have a presence, but they have such good OPSEC. I find, sometimes people get, you know, just kind of, I guess, what's the right word for this? I was going to say, I don't want to use the word lazy, but at the same time, they kind of forget, like, okay, well, they've been doing such a good job with OPSEC. Are they always going to do a good job with OPSEC? If you keep an eye on them, and see where they're active, are they going to accidentally drop something when they, just don't think anybody's watching, right? That type of thing. So sometimes it's something you need to go back to as well, especially if it's like something ongoing where you're like, oh, they might make an OPSEC mistake. People do, but not always.
That's probably, honestly, it's probably the best answer I could ask for. But that begs an awkward question. If you have somebody who's doing very well OPSEC wise, like they have almost zero media presence whatsoever, you can't find anything on them. But man, grandma is posting left and right, and she's exposing this person. What do you tell them? Like, what advice do you give them? Man, tell grandma to cool it on Facebook or something. Like, what do you say to that person?
Yeah. I know, yeah. I guess like the way I look at that is like if you had somebody like say a CEO of a company come to you and they're like, "Hey, can you check my online presence?" Like, I mean, I find like depending who's asking, they're already kind of aware of maybe their presence, not always. It depends. Like, I mean, if they want all the information, then I'll give them all the information. I'm like, hey, right? Because it does depend on who that person is that's asking and why they're asking. Like, is it like, okay, they're in like a sensitive sector or they're working in a sensitive kind of position where they're like, I need to be very careful. That could look different. But yeah, sometimes it's like, okay, well, I would give recommendations, put it that way, right? I would give recommendations in, hey, you know what, this is what I found on your online presence, but this is how you could improve it. And sometimes it's through education, right? Educating those people around you as well, which could be, A, B, and C.
Sure, perfect. So let's say that you found whether, the person has good or bad OPSEC or whatever, but they have information they want to scrub from the internet. Is it
Right.
true that the internet never really forgets, or is there actually a way of, kind of sanitizing your online presence? And if so, how would you do
Yeah, right. Good question. Yeah, like so the internet doesn't forget, which is true. I do agree with that. Because people take screenshots of things. People, even that second, right? I mean, I see it always on Twitter where people will post something and then they'll delete it like a second later. And I'm like, oh, it's the post was deleted. I'm like, okay, they regret that post, or, sometimes it's just a mistake they made and they repost or something like that. But the internet doesn't forget because we do have things like the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine, but also just people making those screenshots, like I mentioned. But there are ways to remove. And the thing is, sometimes you don't know until later, right? Because how would you know? You don't always know if somebody's taken screenshots of something. You have no idea, right? The way I look at it is like, I mean, don't post stuff that you're okay, even behind privacy settings. Like for me, like I'm not gonna post anything on, say it's TikTok or Instagram, and like for me, if I'm posting on those venues and in my my personal world, I'm okay with these being released publicly at some point, because if for some reason somebody takes a screenshot and reposts it, it's not a big deal. Because if it is a big deal, then to me, I'm like, I shouldn't be posting it in the first place.
that makes sense. So you mentioned, so we've kind of talked about the extremes, right? People who have very good OPSEC or people who have terrible OPSEC. But what about the people who have kind of like a mid tier? Like, okay, so they've got an Instagram account, they put a whole bunch of information out there, but it's private. Do you consider, like,
Yeah.
is that easy to get around for bad people or for OSINT investigators, or is that good enough?
There are ways to get around certain things because there's techniques out there. There's OSINT techniques out there that can reveal some of this information that they might want hidden. Because I always think like certain platforms are like they leak information, right? Like Facebook's one of those classic examples, but Instagram's the same. It can in some instances.
Okay.
There's techniques that will reveal things, even if it's a private account. And some people are like, oh, wow, you could do that. I'm like, yeah, you can. And there's also times where, there was a time where you could identify the private Facebook friends of sorry, the yeah, somebody's private Facebook friends, you could identify the entire list just through an OSINT technique, not hacking, simple OSINT technique. They patched it obviously once they discovered that all the OSINTers got into it. But it's like one of those things that I'm like, it was huge because people were finding like hundreds and hundreds of connections that they needed that they didn't have access to before. So, but that technique obviously only lasted so long, but it was still out
Mm,
there. It was still out there for a while.
sure. Yeah. Interesting. All right. Um, well, so kind of wrapping up, but if you had, so just two final questions that I usually ask is, if you had the ear of everyone when it comes to online privacy, what would you tell them? What recommendation would you offer to the people of the world? Hey, this is what I think you should be doing.
Yeah, I would say use privacy settings, but be careful what you post online. Use better passwords. Those are two things that I would suggest if I only could say two things. Um, yeah, definitely better passwords, like stronger passwords, not related to personal things to you that people could easily identify. And then the second one, if you're going to post on social media, which is I think fine because we're all human and we want connection, um, you just want to be mindful of what you're posting. Is it identifying your house address? Can that kind of stuff. Like for me, like I'd be careful that somebody couldn't maybe identify that information just looking at my photo.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Actually, that just made me think of one question I'd like to ask you. But there's a lot of people, there's a lot of scammers out there today, especially whether it's attempting to scam grandma or if it's somebody who's uh, pretending to be somebody else, catfishing, that sort of thing. Should most people, in your opinion, have some OSINT level skills so that they can vet the people that they're talking to online? And if so,
Yeah.
what level do you like? What do you think they should do? What skill sets do you think they should have in order to try and vet the average person, not somebody who's going to really go all in on like an investigation?
Yeah, average person, honestly, like even being able to Google things and use a Google dork. So, to simplify that, if you're going to Google someone's name, putting quotes around it. You're going to Google something like, I mean, it could be simple as like you've hired a babysitter and you want to fact check that they're okay,
Right.
they're going to be safe, or somebody that's going to be in your house. Same thing, like, but simple things like using Google in a better way, making sure that you put quotes around your searches so you filter out some of the noise. Even things like reverse image search. So reverse image search, for those that don't know, again, you're trying to maybe you're trying to fact check some account and you want to see like, does this photo exist anywhere else on the internet? That's what reverse image search will do, right? If I plug that into Google Images or another service, it will tell me if this photo exists somewhere else on the internet. That's one way to prevent being catfished, right? Like that's happened before where somebody's stolen some famous person's photo and that person doesn't know and they seem real maybe at first glance at somebody who might not be able to verify right away. But if you do a reverse image search and you're like, hold on, this is this famous person's photo. Why are they using it? Okay, this doesn't make sense. They look like they've scraped their entire social media platform or are using it as their own now. So there's that.
Did you happen to catch the catfish recently, where some poor woman got conned by thinking that an ailing bat Brad Pitt was like in a relationship with her?
Oh, I did kind of hear about that. Yeah, I didn't go into it, but I was like, is this real? I mean, I think I just I may have read like a headline and I was like, okay, I don't know if this is real, but I can't keep up with the scams these days. That's the thing. But yeah, I take that was real then, in terms of like she actually believed that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's
Wow.
well, I'll say it this way: the catfishing thing seems to happen all the time, but that was just a particularly funny one. I mean, sad,
Mm.
but still funny.
Yeah, there are lots of catfishing examples for sure.
Yep. All right. So, Rita, what's the one thing in security you think that the world should be talking about, but we're not? What's the conversation we should be having, in your opinion,
Insecurity.
or
One thing,
OSINT,
okay.
or anything?
Yeah, the one thing, I mean, I'm gonna think of it like that. One thing in OSINT that we should be thinking about. Um, this might sound simple, but if you're doing OSINT, like one sentence to add value to what you're doing is, why should your customer care about what you're producing for them? Like at the end of you giving your customer whatever it is, report, email with
Mhm.
the results, you need to answer the why should they care question.
Right.
That's what I would say.
That's very interesting. And out of curiosity, what would you typically tell somebody if you did an OSINT investigation on me and you found, whatever it is that you found online, and I said, "Yeah, but why do I care?" What would you tell what would you tell the client?
So I think it's like the why, that depends on what I find about you. So say I dig up all this information about you and it paints a picture of who you are, but like essentially the why they should care is the takeaway. Like, what's the main takeaway from me looking at your online presence? Because they're gonna have an objective, right? They're gonna say, "Oh, we're looking at this individual for this reason." And so for me, it ties back to that question that they had, that they're looking for, right? Identify this person's footprint for blank reason. And to me, you should be able to read, like, that's what I mean by why they should care about this and what it means. Maybe that's a better way to put it. What's the meaning behind everything that they located on that individual?
Very good. Very interesting. Yeah, I think I think that's a perfect way of summarizing why people should actually care about what they have online. That's interesting. All right. Well, Ritu, thank you very much for coming on the podcast today. Hopefully everybody goes and visits you online and starts reading your blog and meets you at your conference later this year.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me on your podcast. And yeah, it's been a great conversation.